Richard Ware, How China's Government Functions. The Communist Party of China, or just the party, is China's governing force, with the paramount leader being Xi Jinping. Their idea of democratic centralism was introduced by Vladimir Lenin, which entails democratic and open discussion. Their highest body, National Congress of the CPZ, is convened every 5th year. Though their government stems from the idea of democratic centralism, the CPC is committed to communism and attends the International Meeting of Communists and Workers, which follows the teachings of Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. The country's most senior decision-making body is the Politburo, holding power which tops every city, company, town, and village in China. And considering their population is above 1 billion, that is a lot of power. Members of the Politburo never face competitive election, making their political stature thanks to their patrons and political survival instincts, showing the professionalism and dedication to their careers. At the Politburo also controls 3 other important branches. These are the Military Affairs Commission, which controls the armed forces, the National People's Congress, or Parliament, and the State Council, which is the government's administrative arm. Their power stems from their position in the Politburo. But in China, personal relations count much more than job titles. A leader's influence rests on the loyalties he or she builds with superiors and protégés, often over decades, which may be why Xi Jinping is so liked. Some making the statement he could also be leader for life like Chairman Mao, who set groundwork for modern Chinese communism in the 50s and 60s. This communist ideology, however, heavily affects how the world views China. To many countries, especially the United States, communism is depicted as this horrible, backward, failed system, and those who enforce it must be lunatics. And even though the stigma against communism has died down, it still affects how we view China. Though the United States has vilified the idea of communism, our government shares some similarities with China more than people think. For example, both are incredibly nationalistic and hypersensitive to criticism made by the media. And both see themselves as top dog of the world, but for different reasons. The U.S. sees itself as preserving freedom, and as China sees itself as the technological innovator who are way ahead of their competitors. The United States also sees China as having succeeded without political reforms, which leads to fear the Chinese autocracy being superior and undermining democracy. And it's been recommended that the Western nations need to counter China's power. In truth, China has pursued significant political reforms throughout the years. Instead of traditional political reforms, bureaucratic reforms were set in motion by then-leader Deng Xiaoping in the 70s. He introduced 3 reforms at the highest level and lowest level of the bureaucracy. These reforms were partial limits on power, accountability, and competition. For Deng's reform on partial limits on power, he shifted from a one-man autocracy like under Mao to a collective leadership, which is now the norm in China. He set term limits in the Chinese constitution, rejected the personality cult, which is like he didn't want to be idolized like Mao, and introduced mandatory retirement. Deng also changed accountability and competition to take place without election. He did this by changing the report cards of Chinese officials. So instead of rising in rank by appeasing the supreme leader like under Mao, rank is earned through economic productivity. Then they released these reports, and that created a lot of competition to who can do the best work. Though these 3 reforms are Western ideas, there is more to democracy that China does not have, such as checks and balances, competitive election, and freedom of the press. What happened during the reform era, China adopted some Western ideas. China is still very much a communist nation, and with various totalitarian qualities. Although China's reforms may see cut and dry compared to other countries, this adoption has created a unique hybrid of governments and ideologies, autocracy with a few Western characteristics. However, bureaucratic reforms can't substitute for political reforms forever, because as China transforms from a basic industrial economy to an innovative superpower, you do need political freedoms, such as free flow of information and society, to have these ideas for continued economic growth. Unfortunately, just as these reforms became the thing that China needs, the Xi Jinping administration has begun backpedaling many of the democratic qualities that Deng Xiaoping had introduced in the 70s. There's also fear of the China model proving autocracy is superior to democracy, making fearful of the success of an authoritarian government. Though China has adopted a few Western ideas, it is still far from democratic. Under Xi, human rights violations have increased along with censorship and religious prosecution. Examples of these violations include some of the heaviest censorship of free speech, news, and media in criticism against the government, along with mass internment of those who are Muslim or practice Islam, and anyone who speaks out against the government will likely wind up in an internment camp. So while China has adopted a few Western ideas, it still is ages away from a true democracy, showing China's tenacity and dedication to communism in previous ideologies and their predecessors. But while this is so, it shows the adoption of Western ideas and democratic ideas has spread, showing the impact of democracy. Thank you.